Welcome to the post-fire soil safety webinar this morning, October 17th. And we're really happy to have you all here this morning, and we'll get started. So for the agenda, I'll be doing the welcome. My name is Suzi Grady. I am with Petaluma Bounty, a farm-based community food security project here in Sonoma County. And Claire O'Brien with UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine will be presenting on contaminants in soil after fire. Julia Van Soelen with UC Cooperative Extension will be presenting on post-fire produce safety after ash and smoke exposure. Glenn Morelli of the County of Sonoma will be presenting on post-fire site remediation process. Rob Bennaton of UC Cooperative Extension will be presenting on soil considerations for food gardens after wildfires. And Todd Kelman of UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine will be sharing about safety of backyard chicken eggs after wildfire. And then we'll have a closing and question and answer period that will be moderated by Mimi Enright of UC Cooperative Extension and myself. So the intended audiences today are people planning to have a garden or have chickens on or alongside sites where structures have burned. The secondary audience is those whose gardens were affected by smoke and ash. And the third would be academics, educators, and community members that are supporting people in the above categories. Some tips about webinars. Everyone's muted. This webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording and slides after the webinar. Please use the chat box for comments and to share resources. As we mentioned, there will be a Q&A box for questions in a session, and we will prioritize questions from participants whose properties have burned. If you want to ask a question but don't want it recorded, please send any of the presenters an email, and we will respond as soon as we can. So to set the context, I just want to say that every fire event is unique. The original produce safety after wildfire study that was conducted in Sonoma County was done after the 2017 complex fires and was known to have significant heat, a lot of structures that burned, and a widespread distribution of ash. And we used that as a baseline for the study that we will drop into today, as well as a baseline for this workshop today, where we focus more on properties that had structures that burned. So the different scenarios that we will cover is ash on landscape from distant fires, house or landscape next door that burned, your house intact, but the landscape burned on your site, and then where a structure or a house burned and the site was remediated. And this is just a map to share. Again, we started the study based on the Tubbs, Nuns, and perhaps the Atlas fire in 2017. But since then, there's been significant burns across the North Bay, as well as across the West Coast. And so with each fire, there's different considerations, but we are sharing our learned experience with others today, because we hope that you can build off of our experience and share our lessons learned with your community, but we'll also share with you what is applicable to your situation and what is not. And then that's just to share that we're all experiencing these fires, and we will continue to as well. So without further ado, I'm going to shift over to Claire, and thank you for being with us.
Hi everyone, good morning. I'm Claire and I am a PhD student at UC Davis in the pharmacology and toxicology graduate group, and my area of expertise is in how wildfires spread contaminants throughout the environment. So next slide, please. So today I hope to provide you with some information on what contaminants might be found in the environment after a wildfire. Next slide. We know that wildfire smoke can carry chemicals and that this smoke can spread over vast distances. On the map on the right, you can see a time lapse of the smoke concentrations that were experienced during the 2017 fires in Sonoma and Napa counties. The dark yellow spots being hot spots where smoke levels were the highest, and you can see that this smoke spread and impacted a large area over Northern California. Next slide. The number one health concern during a fire is smoke inhalation, and it's been well documented that wildfire smoke can negatively impact both the heart and the lungs. Next slide. But there are certain individual characteristics that may put you at an increased risk of experiencing negative health outcomes due to smoke. So for example, if you have a pre-existing medical condition, you might be more at risk from health impacts due to smoke. If you're a lower socioeconomic status, you have a higher risk of ending up in the ER. Or if you have a diet-related disease, such as diabetes, you're at an increased risk of experiencing acute cardiorespiratory symptoms. If you live in an area with high community violence, you're more likely to develop asthma after exposure to air pollution. If you're pregnant, there's a higher risk to both you and your developing fetus, and children are more vulnerable because they're still growing and developing. Next slide. So in addition to smoke, we can be exposed to chemicals in a number of different ways after a fire. The chemicals found in smoke don't just stay in the air, they can deposit onto plants, into soil, and into water, and then burn debris on a site can contaminate surrounding soil and waterways. Plants can then uptake contaminants from the soil and water and incorporate those chemicals into their plant bodies. And then humans can be exposed to these chemicals by either inhaling directly from the smoke, ingesting contaminated plant tissue, or inhaling, ingesting, or coming into contact directly with soil. And ingesting soil particles is a particularly important exposure pathway for children who have high incidences of hand-to-mouth behaviors. Next slide. And there are many chemicals that may be present in soil, both naturally and as a result of the built environment. And some of these soil contaminants may or may not be as a result of fire. So for example, heavy metals can both be naturally occurring, but can also be as a result, for example, lead from leaded paint before 1978. And then there are hydrocarbons such as polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, which are commonly found in areas of high traffic. Dioxins, furans, and other similar chemicals, which may be produced during burning of waste or in incineration. Pesticides from use in residential, commercial, and agricultural areas, and then also petroleum products. Next slide. And after a fire, there are some chemicals that may be elevated in soils, such as heavy metals, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, the dioxins and furans, and benzene, because most of these chemicals can be produced when organic material burns or burning of plastics, electronics, or other household materials. Next slide. And we're concerned about these chemicals because they can cause a variety of health effects in people. So many of them can be carcinogenic. They can disrupt the immune system. They can disrupt our hormone or our endocrine systems. They can cause reproductive harm in both males and females, and they can cause liver and kidney toxicity. And in children in particularly, they can impact brain development, behavior, and then calcium uptake, which impacts growth and dental health. Next slide. And children are more at risk from these chemical exposures, especially in soils because of how they interact with their environment. So children tend to put things in their mouths frequently, such as toys that may touch the ground, or they may actually just ingest handfuls of soil itself. Pregnant women are also more at risk because some of these chemicals can cross the placenta. And then people with chronic illnesses or social and economic hardship may be more vulnerable to health impacts from chemical exposures. Next slide. Additionally, children are more at risk because of the age group that has the greatest contributor to lifetime cancer risk is those who are 0 to 2 years old. So about 2/3 of your lifetime cancer risk is attributable to exposures that you had during this time period. Next slide. However, it's very important to note that the risks associated with soil and air quality represent only a small portion of the overall physical environmental quality and conditions that impact health. So you can see that the physical environment only makes up 10% of the totality of factors that shape the health of a population. The major areas that shape our health are the access to healthcare and the quality of the healthcare you receive, your health behaviors such as tobacco use, diet, and exercise, and then socioeconomic factors such as education, employment, social and family support, and community safety make up most of what determines your health. Sorry, Susie, can you go back one slide? So it's not that chemical exposures are unimportant because we're all exposed to chemicals in our day-to-day lives, but we may be exposed to different levels of these chemicals depending on where and how we live. So the main question we ask is, after you're exposed, who's more likely to get sick? And those who do not have access to education, employment, social support, or adequate healthcare are often disproportionately affected by pollution. Next slide. So when we look at what chemicals are unsafe in soils, heavy metals are typically used as a marker of soil contamination because some of the other chemicals I mentioned earlier, such as dioxins, can be very difficult and costly to measure. And then the US EPA and the California's Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, or OEHA, will set soil screening levels for some of these chemicals, which are often used as initial cleanup goals. And they set a safety threshold where exposure to a chemical at a given concentration will result in no more than one case of cancer in 1 million people over a 70-year life period. And then in California in particularly, we have Proposition 65, which is a ballot initiative that provides a warning to California residents about exposures to chemicals that may cause cancer, birth defects, or other reproductive harm. And they set a safety threshold that identifies a level of exposure that results in no more than one case of cancer in 1,000 individuals, 100,000, individuals over a 70-year life period. But it's important to note that individual counties and cities may have also set their own individual cleanup goals. Next slide. So just in summary, wildfire can distribute chemicals throughout the environment, but whether or not you experience a health outcome because of your exposure to these chemicals is dependent on a number of factors. The first one being, how toxic is the chemical? So is it toxic to you only at a very low dose, or does it take a very high amount of the chemical to have you experience a health outcome? How persistent is that chemical both in the environment and in your body? Do you get rid of it quickly? How long are you exposed to that chemical? So are you chronically exposed for more than 3 months, or is it an acute exposure, which lasts typically less than 24 hours? And then most importantly is really your personal context. So these are things that are personal to you, such as age, whether or not you have a chronic illness, what your health behaviors are, and other socioeconomic factors. So thank you. And with that, I will pass it on to Julia to give you some information about the produce safety study.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Claire, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm Julia Van Soelen Kim, and I'm a food systems advisor with UC Cooperative Extension. And today I'll be talking about what many of you have been experiencing over the last many weeks, where we've had lots and lots of smoke in the air and ash falling on our homes and our environment. And I'll be sharing an overview of how wildfire smoke impacts the health and safety of our locally grown produce from our backyard gardens, our community and school gardens, and local farms. And this information draws from a UC Davis study, or a UC study done after our October 2017 wildfires that happened in Sonoma County and across the North Bay. The study was a unique partnership between the university and the community, and we call it civic science because it had a lot of engagement with community members helping to collect and contribute produce samples from their yards and their community gardens and farms. Ultimately, this study resulted in a scientific report, in a toolkit for other communities who are interested in doing this kind of science to investigate their own unique context, as well as a recorded webinar, which all of that is available online if you'd like to go into more depth. Next slide. So as I mentioned, my presentation focuses specifically on ash that fell on landscapes from distant fires. And later, Rob will go into more specific context of properties that were closely adjacent to and near structure burns or actual properties that had structures burned. So I want to keep that context in mind that in this study, I'm really talking about ash that was broadly distributed over a region. Next slide. And the central research question that we were investigating is the produce safe to eat after it's exposed to wildfire smoke and ash? And next slide. You'll notice, you'll recognize this from Claire's presentation. Next slide. And as I mentioned, smoke and ash moves through the environment, right? It comes through our air in these big smoke clouds, distributing ash onto the surface of plants and onto the surface of soil, and ultimately can move into water and through the environment, ultimately getting into our bodies. But in this case, we chose to really look at leafy greens because they had a large surface area that could be exposed to the greatest amount of smoke and ash. And they were also likely growing in October 2017, this time of year. So we looked at collards, lettuces, kales, and one other leafy green that doesn't come to mind now. Next slide. And this question really was coming directly out of the community's concern. So in fact, a UC Davis study that was done after the October 2017 fires that was conducted in 2018 found that that a quarter of Sonoma County residents surveyed were concerned about the safety of their locally grown produce. And so this was very clearly on people's minds as we were out investigating this topic. We also got a lot of questions at our Master Gardener Help Desk around this. And for those Master Gardeners who are on the webinar today, that probably sounds familiar because again, we're in the same scenario where a lot of people are wondering if there's reason to be concerned. We also knew that farmers were unsure of the potential health impacts of the fires on themselves, their workers, and the consumers. Many farmers in our region were donating their produce to food pantries and emergency relief efforts. So they were really, really concerned about the potential adverse risk of their product and wanted to be well informed. And likewise, school, community, and home gardeners were asking about the potential impact for themselves, but also for the vulnerable populations that they served. Next slide. So diving into the background and the methods of this study that I'm sharing, in just over a month, while fires were still burning and still ongoing, we had 15 volunteers, many of whom were interested residents and master gardeners, go to over 25 sites across the Sonoma County and collect 200 samples of leafy greens. Next slide. The The sites that we collected from really were distributed across Sonoma County. So I know there's not a county boundary under this map, but you can see that this region that's showing is Sonoma County, and the T's are where our sample sites were. And so we had samples collected from across the region. The red on the map shows where our modeling indicated that smoke and ash deposition was the most intense. And that was the most intense ash from the urban burn area of Santa Rosa. We were able to sort of remove the other smoke from other fires and really concentrate on where we thought the most ash from the urban burn had been deposited. Next slide. And our basic study design, because these tests are extremely expensive and ultimately very cost prohibitive for the typical resident, we had to be really strategic with how many samples we tested. And so we were able to send samples from 2 sites initially to start generating our hypothesis. And then as time went on and as we were working to fundraise for analyzing these results, we also realized that the big elephant in the room was soil safety and whether we should also be looking at the effects of contaminants on the soil, since most of the produce had already been eaten or discarded at people's homes. So we added another component of collecting soil samples, and we were able to collect soil samples from 3 sites that we also had produce samples from. And then the last phase of our research looked at a cumulative risk assessment, or a holistic way of understanding the context of eating potentially contaminated produce in the context of knowing that our leafy greens are really healthy and nutritious. And so trying to understand in a more holistic view, what are the considerations? Next slide. In understanding this more holistic view, we have to understand, or we have to define for ourselves, what is unsafe. And so in terms of what is unsafe, we, for the produce, were able to use Proposition 65. And many of you are probably familiar with these, this label. You see it on the outside of buildings or on your coffee or your dried fruit that you may get. And it requires businesses to provide warnings to Californians about chemicals that could cause cancer, birth defects, or other reproductive harm. And they use a no significant risk level, or an NSRL, which is a daily intake threshold that would cause fewer than 1 in 100,000 people in the exposed population to get sick. So I just want to underscore, this is a daily intake level. So it's saying, you know, if you were in this building daily, or if you were drinking this coffee daily, or eating these dried apples daily, then 1 in 100 people exposed in the population could potentially get sick. So it's seen as a very conservative measure of what's unsafe. For soil screening, for soil levels of measuring what's unsafe, we used information from the Environmental Protection Agency, from OHIA, or the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, and also from Sonoma County's cleanup goals that were set for that fire during that time. And we'll be hearing more in a moment from Glenn about those cleanup goals. Next slide. So in summary, what did we find? First, overall, a big sigh of relief here. There was very low concern about chemicals on produce. So next. No samples had detectable levels of lead, arsenic, mercury, or chromium. And so that's a huge sigh of relief. People were very concerned about lead and other heavy metals, and we didn't find any detectable levels. So that's really like the good news headline in our study. The second finding was that no samples had detectable levels of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, or polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs. Next. We did have 12 out of 13 samples had no detectable dioxins and furans. However, one sample had detectable levels at concentrations that were below California's no significant risk level for determining safety under Prop 65. And 12 of 13 samples had no detectable Prop 65 heavy metals. However, one sample did contain nickel at levels that exceeded Prop 65. So if Prop 65 is here, the nickel levels were a little above. However, we learned that there's many different kinds of nickel, some of which is nutritious and some of which is not. And we weren't able to confirm what kind of nickel that was. And so it could have been nickel that's part of a normal diet and at a level that would have been not of concern. Next slide. Oh, sorry, I just mentioned for that last one that we do recommend washing produce in running water. And this is a common food safety practice, regardless of ash contamination. It's always, you should wash your produce, wash your hands before and after harvesting and wash your produce. But we did find that the nickel level was not present in the washed sample. We had washed and unwashed samples. And so we highly recommend washing produce in running water to mitigate any kind of potential risk there. Next slide. So in terms of soil, what we found is also a big sigh of relief. We had low concern, but we do believe that more research is needed. And I'll explain why in a moment. Go ahead, next. We found that heavy metal soil concentrations were below Sonoma County's cleanup goals, so that was really encouraging. We didn't see big concerns about lead or any other heavy metals. No samples had detectable polychlorinated biphenyls or PBCs. Next slide. 3 sites closest to Santa Rosa, where the urban burn boundary was, had the highest levels of dioxins and furans, and the site closest to the urban burn boundary had levels of dioxins and furans that exceeded the EPA and OES soil screening levels. And the big caveat there, next, is that we are not totally able to confirm why that is, right? So we did a little bit of further testing and analyzed samples from elsewhere on that site, and we didn't find evidence of widespread dioxins or furans elsewhere on that site. So we hypothesized that the contaminants may have been unrelated to the fire, as they were not spread out across the site. But more research is definitely needed there to better understand why the dioxins were at higher concentrations as we got closer to Santa Rosa. Next. So with this in mind, with the idea that there was low produce risk and low soil risk with maybe the need for further testing, we wanted to take into account a more holistic understanding of risk. And so we used a cumulative risk assessment model that attempts to understand total risks in the context of the multiple vulnerabilities that we as individuals and as society have, and the multiple protective factors. So in this case, one of the most obvious protective factors is that eating leafy greens is healthy, and they provide important nutrition that also reduces cancer risk. And next slide. So with the help of an amazing graduate student, Vanessa Raditz, they were able to run the numbers and do the math and really understand that there was a net cancer risk reduction. And this slide is a little small, so I apologize, but I do want to go over just a little bit more of the detail. So when calculating a cancer risk reduction, we used a scenario where we thought it was possible, maybe not probable, but possible, that half of the 500,000 person population of Sonoma County increased their daily consumption of produce by 1 serving per day of local produce, I should say. So if they were eating local produce with a little residual ash that had fallen, and they ate 1 more extra serving of collards or kales per day for the rest of their life, that they would have a net cancer risk reduction from eating that local produce. And so that's really good news. And again, the other good news headline of our study. Next slide. So going back to our core research question, is it safe to eat the produce? And we really found that of all the things to be concerned about following a wildfire, produce safety is a low concern. There's a low concern of health impacts from ingesting produce from the urban wildfire smoke that was present in Sonoma County in 2017. As Suzi said, every wildfire is unique and different, and so we want to take that into consideration, but we know that that particular fire had significant structure loss, and so we think that there was something unique there that merited us investigating further. And we found that the potential cancer risk reduction from the nutritional value of eating leafy greens outweighs the potential cancer risks of eating that produce exposed to ash and wildfire smoke. And ultimately, we want to really remind everyone, just like what Claire was saying, there are many considerations that go into determining who is most at risk. And so those who were closest to the fire want to take extra precautions. Those who have pre-existing vulnerabilities, such as chronic health conditions, people who are pregnant, children, and older adults should take extra health precautions and understand their own risk factors. Next slide. So to further reduce the potential minor risk that, that is present in daily life and in our gardens, we encourage you to consider first and foremost what you and your loved ones and community are exposed to. And if you're concerned, take further precautions. And luckily, many of these precautions are good precautions regardless of who you are, where you are. They're just best practices. So the first and foremost is to protect your lungs during smoke events. Stay indoors. If you have to go outdoors, or if you're going outdoors to harvest, wear an N95 mask. Wash your hands before and after harvesting. Wash and remove outer layers of produce before eating, storing, and cooking. So in the case of leafy greens, you would want to remove the outer layers of lettuce on a head of lettuce, for example. And carefully remove any excess ash from surface areas. That's, I say careful and should underscore that because you don't want to get ash thrown back up in the air. Again, the biggest concern is around inhaling that ash. It's not around ingesting it. And so as you're cleaning ash from your residence, from your area, your deck, your garden, you want to be really careful not to toss that back up into the air. And then if you want to have further precautions, you can amend and cover soil with fresh mulch, fresh compost, or other clean soil as needed after a wildfire, smoke, and ash event. And you'll always want to promote good drainage, and you can use drip irrigation to reduce any kind of upsplash back onto the leaves, because again, you want to minimize any kind of ash or soil going back on the produce and getting potentially in a place where you could ingest it. And then you want to keep the outdoors outdoor. So you want to wear your garden shoes, you want to use a boot brush, remove your shoes before you come back in, and keep in mind that, you know, pets and children often track dirt into the house. So be aware of just trying to keep as much dust and ash outside of your house to reduce further exposure. Next slide. In closing, I wanted to share this social media graphic that we have from our study, really summarizing our findings in a nutshell. And you can look to UC Cooperative Extension social media during wildfire events. We try and push this out as a good reminder of our study's findings. Again, the first and foremost tip is to protect your lungs, stay indoors, or wear an N95 mask if you have to be outside. Wash your produce with running water to remove outer leaves or peel any of the skin or outer layers of produce to get rid of any ash on the surface. Remember that eating leafy greens is nutritious, and ultimately nutrition builds your protective factors, your resilience to chemical exposures, and that there's a low risk of harm from produce that was exposed to smoke. And then take extra precautions if you're a child, if you're an older adult, if you're someone with respiratory or heart disease. So next, I'd like to pass the baton on to Glenn Morelli with the County of Sonoma.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Glenn. I'm with the County of Sonoma. I'm the Integrated Waste Operations Division Manager for the county. My background is as a geologist and hydrogeologist in the state of California, performing environmental cleanups and remediation type work. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the cleanup process when a site structure is burned during a wildfire, and noting in this that every fire is going to be different. Different counties, cities, states may have different criteria that are put in place. So let's proceed. Next slide, please. So in 2017, Sonoma County had really its first encounter with wildfires. We had the Pocket, the Tubbs, the Nuns. In the adjoining county, there was the Atlas fire over in Napa. Next slide, please. So for the Tubbs fire, 36,000 acres burned, 6,500 buildings destroyed across the county and cities. Quite devastating. And 5% of the housing stock was lost in that event. Next slide. So, not hard to imagine is there's a large cleanup process involved when that many structures are impacted. And the first phase of that occurred in 2017 was a hazardous waste removal from the sites. And this involved removing the most toxic of the fire debris at a home site, batteries, paint, car parts, asbestos, heavy metals, PCBs, all those things that are really, really difficult for your average contractor to take care of. And in this case, it was performed by US EPA. In fires that preceded this, it's DTSC stepped in, a different specialists have stepped in to perform that. Next slide, please. The second phase of cleanup is the actual removal of visible ash and transporting to a landfill facility. In this case, typically what was performed in 2017 was removal of the top 3 to 6 inches, after the removal of visible ash, 3 to 6 inches of soil was removed from the impacted area, and it was removed to a level of visually clean. And Sonoma County implemented a Cal recycle protocol in this, where the material is wetted and loaded and what we call burrito wrapped in a vehicle, so none of that material flies out of the vehicle going to the solid waste facility. And it also the wetting serves as a protective measure for site workers that ash isn't thrown up while they're loading it, and so they're not inhaling it or taking it in, which is a noted health hazard. Next slide, please. So in 2017, the county tracked this electronically to where we could easily see that a first phase of contamination was removed, and then consequently the second phase where the ash and dirt was removed to a level of visually clean. Next slide, please. So when cleaning up a burned structure, there were several criteria that were put into place that we looked at. We had to take into consideration constituents of concern, and whether dioxins, furans, heavy metals. We had to look at health screening levels, and we also had to look at health screening levels versus background condition. And in this case, it's been mentioned before, But metals were used as marker indicators for this. And then lastly, we're just going to talk about how background was established for cleaning up these sites. Next slide. So as mentioned, constituents of concern for a fire, dioxins and furans, typically that's in an impartial burn. Those constituents can be formed, metals, PCBs, VOCs, hydrocarbons. And really, if you think about your own home where you might live, there's many things that, anything that you have in your house, whether it's electronics or lead acid batteries, they all, after a fire, can serve as a source of contamination in soil. Next slide. So marker indicators. So even though there can be many constituents that are left after a fire that are of concern, many of these can be very costly to analyze for. And for some of the exotics like dioxins and furans, there's only a limited number of labs in the whole country that can actually test for them. So what the county did was implement an existing program that Cal Recycle had, where heavy metals were utilized as a marker indicator. So if the heavy metals were removed to background condition and they met health screening levels, then by virtue of that, the presumption was that all other constituents that we might be concerned about were also gone. Next slide. So in establishing health screening levels, the county looked to utilize through Cal Recycle protocol, US EPA risk-based screening levels, California Environmental Protection Agency screening levels, and DTSC Office and Health and Ecological Risk Assessment levels. Next slide. So these screening levels were only applied when they were higher than, it's important to note, higher than identified background condition in underlying local soils and formations of the burn footprint. So as a general background, there are naturally occurring metals in soils throughout Sonoma County. In fact, most of the state, if not, any soil out there. And in some cases, those levels are actually higher than health screening levels. So when we look at metals remaining after a burn site, where background conditions are deemed higher than published health screening levels, home sites can still be cleared when the results of tests are within 20% of the background data set, despite exceeding published health screening guidelines. And that's just a fact of the world where we live. There will be naturally occurring metals that will exceed health screening levels where you live. And the best example of that in Sonoma County is arsenic, where it typically exceeds health screening levels in most soils. Next screen. So, the establishment of background conditions are based on numerous factors. First, it's based on local geology. Different formations will have different concentrations of metals in soil. It can be set up, background conditions can be set up based on either a statistical model over a large area, or it can be site specific. Statistical models are more useful during larger events where destruction of property has occurred in mass, and it generally results in less cost to property owners and for the cleanup in and of itself. Site-specific models are implemented on a much smaller scale, and by virtue of that, they're more accurate, but at the same time can be more costly. Next slide. So in 2017, for the public program and cleanup of impacted sites, background data sets were collected by Tetra Tech for the different fires. And what you're looking at here is the Sonoma Valley Fire Incident Map. And you will see that a number of background locations were sampled to look at metals in native soils. So quaternary alluvium, Sonoma volcanics, ultramafic formations, and they're basically soil types derived from different geologic formations. So next slide. So once this background data set's established from multiple samples, you'll notice on the first column is background data. So for Sonoma County, Tubbs Fire Incident, and the Sonoma Volcanics, which is represented by TV, there are background metal concentrations. And to the right of that, you'll notice that we have all the screening levels that were identified earlier: Cal EPA screening levels, DTSC HERO screening levels, and US EPA residential screening levels. And you'll notice I have arsenic circled there and a cleanup goal on the right. So let's go to the next screen, please. So in this case, in establishing a cleanup goal, even though, you know, our most conservative health screening goal, the DTSC HERO goal, is 0.07 milligrams per kilogram in soil, native background of arsenic is running at 7.2. So in this case, the cleanup goal was established at 7.2 milligrams per kilogram. Now, antimony, we took the lowest level, which in this case was the Cal EPA screening level of 30 milligrams per liter, and hence the cleanup goal was set at 30 for that analyte. Next slide, please. So after a site's been visibly cleaned, confirmation samples are collected, generally by a licensed professional, and after all fire-related debris has been removed from the property. So in this case, the representative samples are collected to determine basically compliance with the cleanup goals established either by state or federal government and available at the health department. And the total number of samples that are collected are going to be based on the estimated square footage of the ash footprint. The basic goal is to grid a site and get representative samples of the area that was impacted. Next slide. So in this case, if you had a structure that was under 100 square feet, you would take what we would call a 5-point aliquot, which basically means you grid out like a dice, number 5 on a dice, and you grab 5 samples, evenly spread across the area impacted, and you throw them into one composite sample and you send it to the lab and test for it. If you have a larger structure that is up to 2,000 square feet, you would take 4 of these composite samples gridded across the site to represent the footprint that was impacted. And you would compare these analytical results that come back against those health screening levels established by the health department. Next slide. So once soil is found to meet the criteria that you've removed to the cleanup goal criteria of removing ash and impacted soil, the site's cleared for rebuilding. And post cleanup, soil property owners may wish to get that data. Typically, if you participated either in a private cleanup or a governmental cleanup, you're provided a copy of the soil testing data after site clearance. So you should be able to see that the site met the cleanup goals and also have an idea of what concentrations of metals are on soil relative to your property. For real estate transaction, this data should be disclosed and available to new homeowners. Now, if you're buying a property, or if you were unfortunate enough that your property, you lost your property, which I'm very sorry if that has occurred with you, and you did not get this data, you can contact your local health department and they should be able to provide you a copy of the site clearance records for your property. So That concludes my presentation, and I'm going to hand off to Rob now.
Hello, everybody. Just checking in. This is Safe Soils After Fires. Next slide, please. And so the goals of this part of the discussion is post-fire soil health. To understand soil quality, make informed decisions that reduce human health risks for you and your families. We want to manage soils to grow food, family, and farm safely, and we want to use good ag practices to minimize risk over time. We also want to just mention our deepest concerns and prayers to all those who lost their homes. Thank you. Next slide, please. Why is soil so important, right? We know from our understanding over time that soil quality very much affects how your crops grow. Next slide, please. Why is soil health a concern after fires? Contaminants can inhibit plant growth and soil health. They often persist in soils long-term without us knowing because they're not visible, and ultimately affect family and farm health. Next slide, please. How do you assess and reduce risk of possible contaminants in soils after fire? Next slide. Assess risk by site type. It's important to assess your risk by site type. We've already covered number 1, but numbers 2, 3 through 4, house and landscape next door burned. The house may be intact, but there may have been some landscape that burned near your home. And then the full property burned and the site was remediated. Next slide. Fire effects on site soils are something to think about. Burns heat topsoil layers. They reduce the amount of living microorganisms at the site of the burn of that heat in position. The burns also affect organic matter and nutrients. Much of the organic matter goes up and many of the nutrients come out of solution and go down into the soils. Ultimately, ash deposits over time from fires may make soils more alkaline. This also can impact soil structure and water movement from the burns. And so as a result of all of these combined factors, there are temporary changes in nutrient levels and the capacity for soils to exchange nutrients for optimal plant growth and nutrition. Next. So good news. With proper land care and management, soils can be improved and enhanced with remediation, increasing organic matter over time, migration of microorganisms back from areas that weren't burned in the soil matrix itself. And the key factor to think about is time. Don't forget that time is going to tell all. It will take time for this to happen. Soils were developed over millions of years. They won't be able to be 110% improved overnight. Thanks. Next slide. So assessing soil risk depends on a number of key factors, right? Of course, the first one being fire proximity, the extent and trajectory of the wind, the magnitude of that wind, right? In which direction it's going. The settings, are we in a built environment in the case of the urban fires versus wildlands where it may be more forested. The burn temperature, duration, and extent, i.e. magnitude, will also affect the soil risk, and the type of indigenous soils, right? What kind of soil quality did you have in advance of the fires will also contribute to all of these frameworks. And so ultimately, all of these factors will affect the amount and composition of the ash deposited, the extent and the type of cleanup, and the remediation itself, and how that goes. Next slide, please. So post-contaminant types in terms of post-fire, right? We understand that in wildland fires, wood ash deposited on lands are less varied in chemical composition. right? For the most part, most wood ash is of a carbon base. Whereas in built environment building structures are made up of many different types of materials. And burning structures of built environments cause a melting pot effect. The chemicals within those structures in those various parts, the electronics, the plastics, the treated lumber for homes, ultimately mix together, and that can be concerning. Next slide, please. So potential contaminant sites. What may have burned? Let's think this through for a minute. Walk through this, right? In terms of the various kinds of potential properties that may have burned. We know that on some farmlands, there may have been pesticides, petrochemicals, including possibly fertilizers, in barns and garages for farms, managing farmlands. They're in residential properties. Some of the construction materials likely included plastics, which include polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. I often tell folks to say that 3 times fast. Petrochemicals, right? And then the treated lumbers, many of them have preservatives, including heavy metals like arsenic, chromium, and copper, to say the least. On commercial and industrial properties, the smorgasbord gets even more interesting. Some of the materials, again, include PAHs, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, petrochemicals, solvents, potentially lead from pre-1978 homes, and more. And then the soil on properties also burned in many cases and may have had some indigenous levels of metals in some form. Next slide, please. So think about this. Let's walk through the process a little bit, right? Contaminant exposure in produce growing sites. Think of how ash deposits and that the mechanism of that flow. So on soil surfaces, ash would have fallen on the top and over time would likely infiltrate, likely possibly with winter rains, within the soils, into the soil matrix. On plant surfaces, again, it lands on the top of the plant leaves, stems, branches. And then in terms of through the roots, there's potential over time for some level of internal uptake. And then the key thing to think about is lab tests are often needed when chemicals are not identifiable by the naked eye, which is in many cases often. Next slide, please. So crop types to consider in the course of those factors that we just talked about, right? In woody plant crops, mostly fruits and berries, you have root uptake being less likely. Those woody lignified membranes of the roots of woody plant materials make it less possible and less likely that contaminants may have been able to be uptaken from within the soil. Soil dust, however, topical, landing on the surfaces of woody plant crops is still possible. On the other hand, in non-woody plant crops, such as annual vegetables like leafy greens and roots, radishes, carrots, turnips, right? You have the potential for both external or internal uptake. So the roots of those plants may likely potentially uptake some level of contaminants if present in the soil. And at the same time, soil dust at a topical level on the plant surfaces of those leafy greens and roots is more possible as well. Next slide, please. So best practices for managing soils for food growing after fires, right? These are the steps that you can take to continue to prevent exposure over time. We know that sites that burned were fully cleaned up, but these practices can help you to sustain health in the longer run and manage your land well. Some soils are easy to improve. Think about this for a minute, right? Plants grow best with proper soils based on their cultural condition needs, right? Soil nutrients, structure, the composition of the soil in terms of sand, silt, and clay, and then the soil pH are all key factors. It's really important to test your soils, right? In many workshops, we often say, don't guess, but test. And when you're doing your testing, you want to prepare your samples. You want to actually map where you took your samples from on your specific spot on your landscape, right? And you want to connect and correlate the map with the specific spots and label them with the label number, or however you nomenclature your system, with the same label on the bag that you sent to the soil lab. So don't forget that. That's an important key point. So map your sample spots so that you can go back and map your test results to your site, right? Next slide, please. So where to start when planting a new garden or crops after a fire, right? It's important, again, to understand and interpret your soil quality. You need to do your soil testing, do your proper preparation of your samples and map those sample spots, and then undergo best management practices. In many cases here, you are your best researcher, inquirer, educator of your neighbors, and the person on your site who knows your site the best. So you want to observe plant growth, soil organisms, note if you're running into any debris in your soils as you dig. You want to do some soil structure tests. Next slide, please. And think about site history. In terms of thinking about site history, what to look for is key, right? We know, of course, most recently, the relevant site history are the urban fires themselves. And we have gotten from Glenn and others at the county that residents can access post-fire soil test results from their cleanup contractor. Now, on the other hand, in terms of imported soils, testing of imported soils varied to some degree by contractor. Next slide, please. And so it's important to test your soil in terms of the soil's fertility, right? In the thinking about soil testing, think about the kinds of soil tests that are possible. One can go to a Home Depot or other kind of hardware or garden or nursery supply store and buy home soil tests, but there are differences between home tests and lab test results. Those differences include that in do-it-yourself home test, you get basic information and you'll also get generally a range of the results. Whereas in lab tests, you have a tendency to get much greater reliability and precision. So again, don't guess, test your soils and map your sample spots. Next slide, please. So here again, in soil sampling and testing, if you need technical assistance and advising here, the UCCE Cooperative Extension Master Gardener Program is a great resource and will respond to your questions as they arise. They'll respond via email, phone call, and also think about, there are some great publications and resources worth reviewing. Soils in Urban Agriculture, a publication by the University of California Cooperative Extension Urban Ag team, is a really worthwhile read. And sometimes it's worth reading a couple of times to really get the full understanding of the scenario. From that, you'll also note that the EPA, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, suggests that in food growing soils, at the bare minimum, you test for percentage of organic matter, nutrients, and pH, and continue to monitor your pH over time, and that you test for at least lead, possibly. And nowadays, in the cases of many soil testing labs, they will test lead as the one heavy metal they'll do as part of their normal soil fertility panel. Next slide, please. Now, keep in mind, again, you are your best resource in many cases, right? You are the person who knows your site the best, so you are your best personal educator and family researcher, right? Every site is different. Soils vary too. They vary more in urban areas than in more peri-urban and rural spaces, landscapes. But ask yourself, is the soil easy to dig into once you've returned to the property, right? Are you finding any organisms in the soil, worms, insects, insect larvae? Do you come across any debris? Are you running into any PVC piping or any other kinds of built materials that just shouldn't necessarily be there? And then think about some basic tests that you can do. You can do a soil sedimentation test to understand the percentage of sand, silt, and clay in that returned soil. You can do a bean test, planting into the testing site soil, your home landscape, and comparing that with potting soil you bought at the local nursery or garden supply store. Next slide, please. So it's important to recognize the potential for contamination, right? It's not that every site is contaminated. certainly not the case by any means of the imagination, but every site is different. And so you need to know and manage against possible risks and do so over time, and be your best educated resident and land manager. So the best soil safety practices for sites that have burned are next. Next slide, please. So here we connect exposure pathways and soils best practices, right? We're ultimately trying to disrupt the exposure pathway. So in terms of ingestion, inhalation, and skin contact, right? Among those biggest goals include reducing the amount of soil dust in the air. And that's been one of those running themes over the course of this presentation, right? So wear gloves, wear boots. In terms of disrupting inhalation, right? Build raised beds and import clean soils if you have gotten test results back that suggest that's a need. Keep in mind that you can make and use your own clean compost and know what goes into it and manage it yourself over time. And composting is a good agricultural practice as well for managing your landscape. It will keep your plants more healthy. But there is a good amount of research out there that suggests that high phosphate composts in particular will bind and dilute potential contaminants, in particular heavy metals. So keep that in mind as well. And then you want to prevent, again, airborne soil dust and upsplash. How do we do that? Well, a good ag practice as well is to keep your soil covered. We do that by mulching. In the case of veggie beds, that might be more straw. In the case of pathways, that could be wood chips or other landscape materials, but keeping your soil covered will reduce airborne soil dust. And then drip irrigating will prevent upsplash onto the undersides, especially of leafy greens that have deeper veined leaves and have the greater prevalence of likely possibility of particles actually getting into those veins. And also drip irrigation combined with mulch will reduce the spreading of soil particles around your growing beds when growing food. Next slide, please. Best practices for food gardens on or near burned areas. Don't forget, don't consume produce that was growing in close proximity to a fire. Know what you're being exposed to. How do you do that? Have your soils tested. Use best growing practices to minimize risk. Wash hands before or after harvest and wash produce before it's consumed. Also keep in mind, white vinegar can be used as a surfactant to help lift off soil particles, especially in deeply veined leafy greens and some of the root crops. Contain soil with mulch and raised beds when you have found that your indigenous local soil on your landscape has some level of contaminants that are at or above threshold levels. Amend soils with compost or clean soil from OMRI, the Organic Materials Review Institute, over time to improve your soil quality. Promote good drainage, especially at the bottom of slopes. Many of the sites that burned around the state are on slopes, and at the bottom of those slopes, especially after long periods of rains over time, are more likely to accumulate contaminants if there were any present. And use drip irrigation to reduce the upsplash. Keep the outdoors outdoors. Keep in mind our pets and sometimes barefoot kids come into the home and then roll around or play on the carpet. Sometimes our pets sleep with us. So keep all of the outdoors in terms of dust and ash as much as possible. Next slide, please. So keep in mind, the good news is with good ag practices, we can all do our best to grow food and family safely on our farms and landscapes in urban and peri-urban and rural areas. Thanks so much. Now I'm going to pass the mic on to Todd.
All right, here we go. That's me. I am Todd. I'm a veterinarian at the School of Vet Med at UC Davis, and there is my contact info for any follow-up questions that don't get answered here. In that vein, everything that we're about to discuss is available on our website, so don't worry if you don't get it all down now. As Suzi mentioned, we will give you the link to the presentation at the end, and in that there'll be a bunch of resource links to all sorts of things, including our website. So with that out of the way, next slide, please. So here's the big question. Could there be contaminants of concern in eggs of backyard poultry? How do we even know that this is a possibility? You know, the chickens exposed to ash and smoke from urban wildfire could produce eggs with substances like heavy metals in them. Do we even need to be concerned? Well, before we embarked on any investigation about that, we began with a hypothesis, and that hypothesis was really composed of 3 parts. Next slide, please. The first part was this: lead exposure from backyard chicken eggs, a public health risk ? This was a paper from researchers at one of our state veterinary diagnostic labs detailing that lead has been found in eggs of backyard poultry. This has nothing to do with wildfire. The lead was from a variety of sources that we'll discuss throughout the presentation. But what it is a proof of concept that chickens exposed to lead can produce eggs with high lead content. Next slide, please. So the next piece is research like this. So this is a study showing that the heavy metal content of ash from urban wildfire is higher than that from rural wildfire. And now you have the first 2 pieces of the puzzle here. So that something like lead can indeed make its way into the egg, and that we truly do have a potential exposure in wildfire ash, specifically urban wildfire ash. So combine those 2 pieces with what we know that chickens do all day. Next slide, please. Which is this, right? They peck off the ground for hours on end. So there's the making of a pretty good hypothesis that urban wildfire could pose a risk for the production of eggs from backyard poultry that contain heavy metals or those organic intoxicants that Claire told you all about. Next slide. So what comes after a hypothesis? Well, you have to test it with experiment, which is exactly what we did. We put out a call all over the state, social media, all sorts of outlets towards the end of 2017 after the wildfires in Napa, Sonoma, and Ventura counties. We asked for submissions of eggs from backyard poultry. Next slide, please. And we got a ton of them. 344 premises total. That's what all those orange dots are. Average submission about 5 eggs per premise. The little red splotches are outlines of the 2017 wildfires. We got so many submissions from Sonoma, Napa, and then down south by Ventura that the wildfire outlines are almost covered up. So you can't tell much from this zoomed out view, except to say that there is a fairly good representation from both fire affected and non-fire affected areas, which is a bit of foreshadowing. Next slide, please. So if we zoom into one of the fire affected areas, here's the Napa and Sonoma region and the outline of the Tubbs, Nuns, and Atlas fires. So we got submissions from a lot of properties here. There's about 75 from Sonoma, 16 from Napa. And note that none of those were properties that directly burned in the fire, but all were heavily impacted, blanketed by ash and smoke. Next slide, please. All right, so what did we find? Out of all the things tested, the most significant finding by far was the lead content of the eggs. About 8% of those 344 premises, that's 27 properties, had an average egg lead content that exceeded the FDA recommendation for daily intake by a child. So the key question is, where were these properties and what was their relationship to wildfire? Next slide. So what we're looking at here is that whole state view again, and the size and the color of the dots represents the average egg lead content. What we want are small green and yellow dots, because that indicates no to very low levels of lead. What we don't want are the big orange and red dots indicating a higher lead content that exceeds that FDA threshold I told you about. So here's the key. What we're looking for to support our hypothesis is a distribution of big orange and red dots closer to urban wildfire and the smaller green and yellow dots farther away. Honestly, from this view, it's hard to tell, but you can see some big red dots in and around places like Sacramento, in Stockton, and in LA. These were some of our highest lead values, and these were sites that were not directly impacted by ash. By smoke, absolutely, but by comparison to the exposures in Napa, Sonoma, and Ventura, not so much. But just to make sure, let's zoom in again to one of the fire affected areas. Next slide, please. So here we are back at the Sonoma Napa region. And again, we're looking for the big orange and red dots close to wildfire, the smaller green and yellow dots farther away. And that's just not what you see here. In other words, when we ask ourselves, does this data support our hypothesis that proximity to urban wildfire is a driving force for lead in eggs of backyard poultry? And the answer is not so much, not by this data anyway. So right now you're probably thinking, well, then if it's not wildfire, what is it? Where is the lead coming from? And I want you to hold on to that thought for just a moment. We're going to get to it in a little bit of a roundabout way that keeps this discussion wildfire focused, because that's why all of you are here. This is probably a good time to note that our previous webinar goes into a lot more detail about our findings from this study. And again, we'll give you a link to that at the end of the presentation. All right, but back to the issue at hand. So our data really doesn't support the hypothesis that proximity to wildfire is the key to the most significant thing we found, which was lead in eggs of backyard poultry. Next slide, please. So is that it? Is that the end of the story? All right, let's take a step back. Remember, our study is really designed to assess sort of an average risk for households that were not directly burned in wildfire, and that part is key. Especially for those of you that have properties that burned, your circumstances are different, and most importantly, they're unique, just like Rob and everyone else was saying. Each one of you has very different considerations that we've touched on, but to really drive that point home, let's go over what some of those individual circumstances might be, especially those with specific relevance to backyard poultry. Next slide, please. And here's the first one. Do you have a vehicle or multiple vehicles that happen to burn on your property? Think about all the things that could be released when a vehicle burns. You think about all the petroleum products, the gases, the oils. You think about all the various fluids like transmission and brake fluid. Think about the heavy metals and lead acid batteries, and there is a lot of lead in there, like on the order of about 20 pounds. Think about heavy metals in things you wouldn't even necessarily think about, like electronics, even the tires. All of those things have at least some potential to be abruptly released into the environment upon burning. Next slide, please. Next, think about how old is your home? Do you have plumbing that was installed before 1986? That could have a higher amount of lead in it. Is your paint from before 1978? Same thing. In fact, that was actually one of the associations we uncovered during a follow-up study to assess how that lead may have gotten into the eggs. Houses with old paint had a much larger percentage of eggs with high lead egg content than houses with newer paint. Next slide, please. Got to think about what appliances and electronics you had in your household that may have burned. All can contain various heavy metals to think about. Next slide, please. And here's one that's not really inherently obvious. Do you have any older furniture in your house that may have burned? California in particular has a not so glorious history about this. In 1975, a regulation was passed in California that required fire retardant chemicals in furniture and baby products. That legislation wasn't updated and enacted to essentially reverse that until January 1st, 2015. So furniture made before that date likely contained some fire retardant chemicals, those PBDEs that Claire discussed in the beginning. I know my couch is certainly older than 2015. If something like that does manage to burn, and those fire retardants can only do so much when directly exposed to fire, those can be released into the environment. Now, this is a really good time to point out that these are completely different substances than that red stuff that's dropped from airplanes as fire retardant. You might have heard of like Phos-Chek and things like that. That's what that red stuff is. Those are not reported to be hazardous unless you're involved in mixing them in preparation for a drop. Then the dust can be like an irritant to the eyes, lungs, and skin, things like that. But it should not pose a hazard for you. All right, so if you combine all of these individual factors with, next slide, Once again, what we know chickens do all day, and you can see why predicting individual risk is so hard. Next slide, please. All right, so we're at the big question. Is it safe to eat the eggs from your backyard poultry? And because of that large variability in individual risk, we can't give you a definitive answer to that question. But what we can do is tell you how to assess your risk and how to reduce your risk, things to consider on top of all the stuff that Glenn and Rob discussed about testing and risk reduction. So first, assessing your risk. Next slide, please. All right, this is the CAFS lab, the California Animal Health and Food Safety Laboratory System here in California. We have 4 of these around the state. The link for them is on our website. You'll be able to find it. They're very easy to Google. If you are from out of state, and I think a few of you are, your state has a state veterinary diagnostic lab like this. Just Google veterinary diagnostic lab and then insert your state name. If you have trouble finding it, just email me and I will help. So what you do with these folks is you send them eggs to be tested for heavy metals. So like Glenn mentioned before, we're going to use heavy metals as sort of our marker analyte for everything else. The test runs about $60, so that's 60, so it's not cheap. So your best bet is send them 4 to 5 eggs to be pooled, meaning they'll mix them all together. You get an average heavy metal content over those 4 to 5 eggs, which is perfect. That's exactly what you want. And calves will also send you with your results how to interpret those results, which is really important. All right, there's actually one other option for you California residents and the CAFS labs, which is you can, if you're a backyard poultry enthusiast, you can send them up to 2 birds. Let's say you have 2 birds that are sick or that have died and you don't know why, or maybe you have 2 that you're not so attached to. You can send them in for a necropsy. Basically, that is the veterinary version of an autopsy. And they do it as a public service. So they only charge $25 for that because it helps them sort of figure out what kind of things are going on in the state. Depending upon your sort of exposure risk, they decide what tests to run. So if you send in birds and you tell them I'm from a fire affected area, that will increase the possibility that they will go ahead and run heavy metal testing because birds can accumulate lead in tissues like liver and bone. And so that's good to know too. So you might be able to get a lead test that way of the birds themselves, not the eggs. If you're going to go that route, call them first and explain your situation so you're all on the same page. Okay, so that's how to assess risk specifically from the backyard poultry angle. Next slide, please. Which brings us to reducing the risk. And there's various ways that we can do that with poultry. Next slide, please. All right, here's the first. Keep food confined and off of the ground. And I gotta say, most chicken feeders are not great at keeping food off the ground. It might start out off the ground, but a lot of it ends up on the ground eventually, and that's exactly what we don't want. So a feeder like this does a much better job of keeping food away from the soil. And you actually get the side benefit of potentially reducing your rodent population because they can't easily get into container food like this or a feeder like this. Speaking of feed, one other thing you can do is make calcium readily available, like oyster shell, free choice oyster shell, because that can prevent the absorption of lead. Next slide, please. So next, keep chickens confined to a particular area of the yard if you can. Even better, put them on raised beds. Raised beds aren't just for gardens, they could be for chickens too. And so raised beds with fresh soil after all that testing and remediation that Glenn and Rob talk so much about, that's a good mechanism for keeping you safe. Next slide, please. And know what's going into your chickens. And my primary concern here in this regard is the water supply. If you're on residential water, the EPA requires community water systems to deliver an annual consumer confidence report, also known as a drinking water quality report. But that really only covers water from the treatment plant, depending upon where you live. Likely everything from your service line on towards your house is your responsibility. So know something about it, know how old your plumbing is. You can even test the water out of your faucet for lead. And I recommend that if you have a particular spigot out by where your chickens are, that you test that water as well, if that's the water you're using to provide to your chickens. We ran into a situation in our follow-up study where the water from inside the house was just fine, but there was this one old pipe that ran out to the chickens that had high lead content, and that water was affected. If you are on well water like I am, it's on us to know what's coming out of your well. So get it tested at the wellhead, as well as knowing all this other stuff about the state of your plumbing, just like in the residential water situation. Next slide, please. All right, so how can you learn more about all things poultry, including things that are wildfire related like this? Well, you are in luck. Next slide, please. We have a website that looks like this, which we will give you the link for. On our website, we have all sorts of resources for backyard poultry folks, including the wildfire specific stuff that we're talking about. We've got a link to our new YouTube page that has our previous talks in them, and we'll eventually have this one. We have a link to our app on the Google Play Store that covers all things backyard poultry related. But even if you forget the link, which we're about to give you, finding us is incredibly simple. Next slide, please. If you just Google UC Poultry, meaning University of California, just Google UC Poultry, we are always the first hit. So we are incredibly easy to find. All right, so that brings us to the end of the poultry part of the webinar. And now Suzi is going to bring us home with a bit of recap.
Thank you. So to go over, we've covered a lot of ground, and a reminder that all of these resources will be available online, and we'll get to that shortly. But best practices for food gardens includes investigate your site history and acquire tests done during site remediation, if applicable. And if needed, test or retest your soil to have those results. Remediate by removing contaminated soil. If contaminants are found, you can add mulch and compost to prevent airborne soil dust. Reduce human, pet, poultry contact with soil dust, and use drip irrigation to prevent upsplash. So to access this presentation, including the resource links, please visit this website on the UCANR webpage. And I'm going to click ahead, and you'll see there's a number of resources that will be hyperlinked if you go to this website. So for more information, we have the Produce Safety After Urban Wildfire webpage, which includes some of the documents that you saw here, as well as previous webinars. Then there's the UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine Poultry Wildfire Resources that Todd mentioned. There's the UC Master Gardener 2018 workshop video titled Effects of Fire on Soil, to go deeper into exactly what happens when a wildfire passes over a patch of soil. Sustainable Firewise Landscape Design and Maintenance. There's the Resilient Landscapes 2020 workshop video. UC Master Gardener program of Sonoma County Firewise Landscaping webpage. A number of different resources. This is more local, but on how to make your landscape more firewise and ready for the next wildfire event. And then UC Cooperative Extension publications on soils in urban agriculture with soil testing and sampling information can be found at that site. So now we're going to shift over to the question and answer period. Please go ahead and use the Q&A box. Mimi and myself are going to help administer this piece. And Mimi, just a note, my video is not working, so feel free to click on if you'd like.
Got it. Thanks, Suzi. So if we could have all of our presenters restart their video. Really, for the questions we got during the presentation, all of our presenters were doing a really great job fielding those questions and answering them. But Rob, I felt like one kind of consistent theme, and I was wondering if you could expand on this a little bit more. I know you did do some answer, but I thought we could talk about this verbally. In terms of soil testing. And I think since a large portion of folks who RSVP'd to attend this workshop were not on properties that had a direct fire impact, but were impacted by ash and air pollution. Your thoughts on soil testing for folks who were maybe some distance from a direct fire burn, but who want to understand considerations for soil testing if they're concerned. And you're muted, Rob.
All right. I think everybody can hear me now. Okay, thanks so much. So the extent of concern about soil quality after a burn is going to be in part related to the proximity to the burn and the type of burn, right? Was it urban versus a natural area? So if you're much closer to urban, I would say that you have the potential to think about, you might want to think about testing for lead. Think about all of those things that we covered in terms of what may have burned in the what may have burned slide, right? Lead, heavy metals in, for example, treated lumber used for construction. So arsenic, a little bit of copper, chromium, those kinds of metals may be worth thinking about testing for. But what I would say is start with your lead and or soil fertility first and get a sense on how that soil quality is. And then if you find red flags on your property because you've mapped your sample spots for your testing, then go back and do additional testing. Testing can over time be expensive, and soil fertility for just pH and nutrients and cation exchange capacity and organic matter is relatively cheap as compared to when you start to test a panel of heavy metals comparably. So if you start small and then test additionally beyond that, when you find there's concern, you'll probably be better off and also save money over time. I also wonder if Glenn had additional thoughts on that as well.
Not really. I mean, you know, metals from most labs run between, if you're going to run what's called a CAM 17, which is 17 different California assessment metals, it's typically between $125 and $180 to get that panel analyzed. But sometimes labs will have homeowner packages where they'll run like a 5 metal scan for much less. And especially, you know, if you've been impacted by one of these fires, some of the labs in the past have had special for homeowners if you're concerned, and they'll have special pricing for people. So it's something to ask the lab if you call them up. And just for general soils, they generally have packages that you can talk to them about. In Sonoma County, and not on behalf of the county, but because I can't recommend anyone, I'd say like Alpha Analytical is good, Brelgen Race is good. There's a lot of local labs, and they're generally pretty good, and they're knowledgeable about what most homeowners are looking for in their soils.
Great.
Also add that in some cases, some of the county cooperative extension master gardener programs have lab lists of local and regional labs. It's very important to note that those lab lists are not endorsing any one particular soil lab, but is providing a list of potential labs. And in some of those lists, it also notes what they test for, including whether or not they test for heavy metals, what heavy metals, and also the degree to which they may test for vegetative tissues as well.
Great. Thank you, Rob and Glenn. And Glenn, a follow-up for you in the chat. Given the extent of the fires, I'm assuming here in Sonoma County this year, or perhaps statewide, but I think the context is 2017, so I think Sonoma County specific. Is there any consideration to repeat the testing that was done in 2017?
On homes, to repeat the testing on homes that burned before?
Yeah, I have to
Or-
assume that's what Debbie's referring to. Debbie, if you can expand on that in the chat, that would be helpful.
I think Debbie's asking about the produce study.
Produce and eggs. Yeah.
Ah,
I'm
great.
happy,
Thank you,
happy to
Julia.
answer that.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Thank you.
so great question. Thank you, Debbie. So we, as part of our study, it was really important to us that we were using the 2017 wildfire as an opportunity to study the effects of that wildfire and also build the potential for other communities to study the unique effects of their wildfires or of our own community in future wildfire events. So we developed a really great toolkit for communities, ranging from like, how do you use social media to recruit participants to collect samples, to the actual sampling guidelines for the produce and the soil that are both coming out of, people from UC Berkeley who really had an eye towards the science of how do we ensure high rigor in collecting the samples within a community or civic science context. And then all the way down to how do you then interpret the results. And so that toolkit is available on our website and will be part of the follow-up resources. And so we highly encourage, if anyone's inspired, we highly encourage this study to be replicated because we really think it was potentially unique to our 2017 fire and is worth replicating elsewhere to see if the findings are consistent. Now, the second part of your question is around fruit trees and nuts. And I'll give my first take and then let Rob expand. So we chose to look at leafy greens because we thought they're growing during this time of year, during the fall harvest. A lot of people had them in their gardens or on their farms. And because they have this large surface area to be picking up and collecting ash, as well as potentially absorbing contaminants into the structure of the plants. We had some preliminary research on the urban agriculture context and PAHs being picked up in urban gardens. And so we suspected that might be the case with leafy greens exposed to smoke. Unfortunately, our tests weren't sensitive enough to pick up whether there was PAHs present at levels that would be of health concern. And so there's a real limitation on the labs that can analyze PAHs. It's extremely expensive test, and we also ultimately didn't have enough sample size of each of the leafy greens to test that in a way that was robust. And so so we don't know, but I'm just saying why we chose leafy greens. Now we think with things like tree fruit and nuts, that there's far less of a concern of them taking up contaminants from the air, right? They're enclosed, and so they're not going to have the surface of the ash coverage is less of a concern, and we think there's less of a concern of them picking up contaminants from the air or the roots. And I'll let Rob expand there on the difference between, we've got leafy greens above ground, we've got root vegetables, and then we've got the more woody trees and shrubs that are producing fruit.
Certainly. So in terms of nuts, right, that outer covering protects the nuts generally quite well. In terms of fruit, trees, and shrubs, the concern is much more if there were any topical soil dust concerns and or ash deposition, if any, that had some chemical constituents in it that might be problematic. But as far as uptake, there's very minimal uptake from a woody perspective. Again, a good washing of the produce helps tremendously. Also, think about the type of fruit tree crop, right? Is it a hairy peach, right? Is it catching more particles, things like that. And then, continue to do the best practices, minimize the soil dust with mulch, drip irrigate, all of those processes will help tremendously as well.
Great. Thank you, Rob and Julia. Okay, we have a chat comment from Virginia. My home and landscape was completely destroyed last month in the Sequoia National Forest. I visited a few weeks after fire and my elderberry trees were sprouting back up. What can I do to help my grow to recover at this point? Rob, do you have some thoughts on that? I did share in the chat earlier a great blog post done from UC Berkeley Botanical Garden that talked about considerations in your landscape garden. And I wanted to make reference to that. But Rob, any suggestions from a perspective in terms of supporting the elderberry on recovery post-fire?
So it's kind of funny that you ask. Elderberry is my all-time globally favorite fruit shrub, period, and or native shrub, period, for a whole bunch of reasons I won't get into time. But elderberry are particularly known for having a very, very high root to shoot ratio. And so if they're resprouting, of course, eventually they'll flower and fruit. Cutting back down maybe the first season just to make sure you don't have ash deposition or soil dust concerns, maybe something to seriously consider. The likelihood it's going to really, in the long run, damage the elderberry is somewhat low, although I would say don't take more than 2/3 off the plant, off the top, so that you give it a good fighting chance to really push out even more roots to then get more shoot growth as well. But if there is concern about ash deposition or soil dust, elderberry particularly, those berries are very, very small in an umbel form. And so the potential for catching ash or dust is a little bit higher because they're so proximal to each other as well. And then the other reality is a lot of the smaller spiders like to hang out in there because they get other bugs too. So there might be some webs that have caught some ash as well.
And there's a great suggestion, Virginia, in the Q&A to talk to a qualified arborist or biologist regarding pruning. That's always a recommendation we make from the Master Gardener program. A follow-up question from Virginia. Rob, any suggestions you might make around the soil at this point in support of her elderberry trees resprouting?
Take a broad fork, find the do a rough measurement of the diameter of the canopy width, right, of the shrub, right? Add about 25 to 30% to that diameter width, right? Take a broad fork, just poke straight holes around that perimeter, right? Add maybe an inch of good, well-finished compost. Maybe add some deciduous tree leaves, like an inch or 2 or 3 or 4, doesn't really hurt, it'll all decompose. And then maybe add a little small layer of wood chips on top of that just to hold those leaves down. And the poking, of the broad fork into the soil will help with the infiltration of the nutrients over time. It'll also help with increased infiltration of water during the fall, winter rains, and hopefully over time replenish the health of the elderberry shrubs.
I'd like to add too that the UC webinar on the fire landscape and Mimi, the one that you shared with us, also has a lot of great information about how the environment needs to repopulate the microorganisms, and that there's different phases of the all the different types of plants that will come in, because I hear that Debbie is also talking about a grove and not just necessarily the elderberry bush. So I recommend that as a next step to understand kind of the successions that area will go through. And then also I just wanted to note, I think we need to keep answering questions, of course, but I forgot to show the thank you slide. So I'm going to shift over to that.
Fantastic. And I think we've wrapped up on questions. So perfect timing, Susie.
Rob, did you have an additional?
I was just going to add, your point is actually very, very pertinent, and also, particularly you can inoculate with actinomycetes, mycorrhizae, that'll help with that bacterial punishment over time in the soil as well.
All right, are you seeing this?
We sure are.
Okay.
You want me to wrap up, Susie? So I'll wrap up for Susie since her dog is trying to participate in the workshop. We also want to, first of all, I would like to send a huge thank you out to all of our presenters today. We started conversations over 5 months ago about holding a workshop of this nature. We started getting questions here in Sonoma County from homeowners who had moved back into their rebuilt homes post our 2017 fires and had concerns about growing food. So that was really the spark that, well, maybe that's not the right analogy to use for us to, you know, during fire season, but that was the prompter for us in developing this content. And certainly there's a huge amount of additional information and research that we hope continues in the years to come as we adapt to this new world and new fire ecology that we're living in. But beyond the folks that are you've seen on the presentation in the workshop today, big thank you to our team, including Vanessa Raditz, who was one of the founding members of our produce safety study after the 2017 fires, Maurice Bateski from the UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine, Odette Klemp from the same organization, who was a huge help to us administratively on the back end of this, and Julio Contreras with UC Cooperative Extension. And also, if any of you on the workshop today participated in our citizen science study in 2017, 2018, huge thank you to everyone who participated. And we definitely would love it if you would take just a few more minutes. We've finished up a little early. We'd love it if you could take a few more minutes of your time to complete our poll for the workshop today. It helps us understand how type of information we've shared with you and how we can better improve for moving forward. And yeah, huge thank you. Anybody else with any wrap-up comments while we close out with the poll?
Thank you for everyone participating on a
Yes.
beautiful Saturday morning.
Yes.
We appreciate your time and attention and good comments. I think all of our presenters here today are happy to continue trying to answer questions that are unique to your site. We know this is very, very complex science and very complex to the unique context of your site. So we're happy to stay on and answer follow-up questions in the chat or the Q&A or via email, and we'll try our best to be responsive.
And we will definitely send out a follow-up email to everyone who attended and all those who RSVP'd. I think we had a few snafus with folks getting the link, with a link to the recorded workshop, as well as some of those numerous resources and links I was sharing in the chat box, and a link to the presentation, which was also in the chat box. Hopefully you all know about the trick in the chat box that you can click on the 3 dots on the bottom right of the chat, and that lets you copy the chat if there's any of those links that you want to save and do some more research and exploration on your own.
Thank you, Mimi. I was going to say that because somebody had a question on saving the chat box.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. So any other questions that have come up that folks think we need to address, or we'll just answer the chat and Q&A, I think is good.
No, and hopefully my dog won't participate again, but so I also just, as a community partner, wanted to share that this has been an amazing project to be part of, and it came out of fielding concerns of our community. And so this by no means is the, one-time conversation about these things. We're hoping this is the baseline for subsequent research. And at this point, we wish there were someone to hand it off to in the larger UC system or somewhere else, but it's been a very grassroots effort, and I'm focusing more on the produce safety. And that's why it was amazing to have our community step in and provide donations to make this happen. And so we'll continue to support however we can, and know that at this point, a lot of us are doing this as volunteers because we are very passionate to make sure everyone feels comfortable growing their own food. So just wanted to provide that context as well.
Okay, and Nan, to your comment that you can't copy the chat, I'll make sure any links that I shared are shared in a follow-up email. So we'll make sure we get those to you. All right, well, once you've wrapped up with the poll, I think we're at a close. Thank you all so much for taking your time out to participate in this. We hope you'll help spread the word on these good resources. I think so many of us on the Western United States. We actually had some folks who RSVP'd from Oregon and Washington are going to be grappling with these questions in the years to come. And I think we're all going to be doing everything we can to help educate each other and adapt as we move forward.
We wish you the best of health.
Yes, absolutely. Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye.